The New Orleans Saints drop a tough one to the Philadelphia Eagles, but I'm going to tell you why it's okay to stay calm and why you don't need to push the panic button, at least not yet. We got all that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst on WWL TV. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to break down what it is that the New Orleans Saints defense struggled to do in terms of playing a full 60 minutes. What happened? What went wrong? We'll dive into all that. We're also going to take a look at what it is that the Philadelphia Eagles did to give the New Orleans Saints so much trouble on the offensive side, especially when it came to getting rid of their run game and the ripple effect of impacts that they had on that. But before we dive into all that, I want to assure you that there is no reason to push the panic button when it comes to the New Orleans Saints just yet. I will let you know when it is appropriate to do so, but right now I do not believe is that time. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at FanDuel. Right now, FanDuel, of course, America's #1 sportsbook, is doing some incredible things. Right now, if you put down your first $5 bet, you're going to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just head over to FanDuel.com to get started today. The New Orleans Saints lost a tough game. All right. A very, very tough game. I'll play therapist here for a moment, and I'm going to let you know there's no reason to hit the panic button just yet. The New Orleans Saints are off to a 2-1 record for the second year in a row, and this 2-1 feels massively different than last year's 2-1, just like this year's 2-0 felt massively different than last year's 2-0. I want to take you back to the beginning of the season. One of the things that we talked about before the season even began, when we saw the schedule for the New Orleans Saints, we talked about how their opening stretch of 5 or 6 games is probably their toughest portion of the schedule. It gets a little challenging with the sort of, let's call it the first 7 games is really tough, just because you got some short weeks and stuff like that you'll have to navigate all throughout. But anyway, one of the things that we talked about was that if you can get one of these games in terms of a win against the Dallas Cowboys or a win against the Philadelphia Eagles, you set yourself up to finish 3-2 through the first 5 games. The New Orleans Saints are still very, very much in that exact situation, with an opportunity to go 3-2 to open up the season, or even 3-1 first off to open up the season up against the Atlanta Falcons. Then you walk into an AFC Monday night matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs that if you drop, it doesn't impact your tiebreakers, things like that. It doesn't have as much of an impact. So if New Orleans right now in this situation, 2-1, can win next week against the Atlanta Falcons, you feel very, very different than you feel right now, just a week from today. So I highly, highly encourage anybody that I've already had people write to me to say the Saints need to fire Dennis Allen, that they need to bench Derek Carr and put in Spencer Rattler. I've had somebody say that Klint Kubiak is a joke. Like, let's just bring it down a little bit. None of those things are true. None of those things are necessary. There's no reason to move on after one loss in a season. That was a tough and a hard-fought battle between these two teams. One of the better games that I've seen in a long time that wasn't just an all-out blowout. These were two defenses that were matched very well against the offenses that they were going up against. Philly made some great adjustments over on the defensive side to eliminate the run. It's just that it was New Orleans whose offense couldn't get off the ground, and it was New Orleans defense that gave up the big explosive plays that ended up being the decision or the deciding factors in this game. So please, this is not a panic button situation. This is not the Saints need to fire somebody or bench somebody type of situation. This is an exact opening that we talked about would be good for the New Orleans Saints this offseason to at least come out of the first 3 games 2-1. They have done that. Now they have a big test in terms of their ability to respond going up against the Atlanta Falcons. So what I will say here is that for New Orleans going into this game against Atlanta, this is where we enter the part of the conversation it's not about it's not about what goes wrong. It's about what you do next. Well, it's all about what the New Orleans Saints do next. And if they drop their game next week against the Atlanta Falcons, it is perfectly acceptable to start raising eyebrows and start raising larger questions, because then you're looking at, okay, was that really the New Orleans Saints going up against two, teams that were just beatable teams, and we just didn't realize how beatable they were at the beginning of the season, with the exception of the Carolina Panthers. And then now they're going up against some more formidable opponents and then end up being that way. But look, we also knew that Philadelphia was going to struggle in the run game going into, or had struggled defending the run coming into this game. That ended up not being at all what Philadelphia looked like. They were well prepared. They had a good scheme, and they executed it much better than the New Orleans Saints executed their run plan over on the offensive side. That ended up being a big time difference in this game. In just a moment, we're going to break down a little bit of what it is that Philly did and how New Orleans will have to look to counter that moving forward in the future. But man, this is not yet a situation to where you're ready to flush this season down the toilet for the New Orleans Saints. But if they start dropping more games and they drop this game against the Atlanta Falcons up next week, perfectly acceptable to start asking bigger questions and having sort of larger reactions and things like that. Will I? No, because it's still only 4 games into the season. But I will say this. What you saw from the New Orleans Saints over the course of their first 2 weeks of the season was not a mirage. All right. Utilization of play action, utilization of motion, utilization of the outside zone run. These are all things that teams across the NFL win games with and lose games with. This is the way that it goes sometimes. And so what you're seeing from New Orleans in terms of their ability to be able to execute their system, it ran into a wall today. Shout out to the Philadelphia Eagles for doing a great job limiting New Orleans. And then you can look at New Orleans on both sides of the football, offense and defense, and point fingers at exactly what it is that went wrong. But none of that matters. What matters is what the New Orleans Saints will do next. And what they need to do next is very much within their playbook. It's not a situation like last year where you needed the team to turn into an entirely different team in a way that you had never seen before in order for them to win games. This is absolutely within the New Orleans Saints reality to get back on a winning pace going into next season or going into next week and still playing winning football. We're also talking about a defense, and we're saying that the defense and offense both contributed to the loss, but still a defense that only allowed 15 points. That should be a situation. And look, a lot of that had to do with Nick Sirianni and the Philadelphia Eagles. I get it. I understand why people are not big fans of Nick Sirianni as the head coach. There was some awful decision-making because this game should have been an absolute blowout. I can see the stats behind me. 288 pass yards to 130 pass yards in favor of the Eagles. 172 rushing yards against 89 rushing yards in favor of the Philadelphia Eagles. 460 total yards to 219 yards in favor of the Philadelphia Eagles. This game should not have been 15-12, but shout out to the New Orleans Saints defense for showing up at least early in places where they needed to show up. But giving up a big 3rd and 16 because you got guys running into each other is absolutely unacceptable, and something that the Saints defense themselves looks at as unacceptable. So the good news here is that you don't need the New Orleans Saints to turn into a team that they haven't ever shown you that they could be so far in order to win next week's game against the Atlanta Falcons. Instead, you're looking at a New Orleans Saints team that just needs to be what it was over the course of the past 2 weeks and be what it intended to be coming into this game in order to get back on a winning track in week 4 in Atlanta. So I'm not ready to hit the panic button on these New Orleans Saints just yet. I advise the same for you, but definitely keep your microscope handy, keep everything handy, keep the button handy, because if the New Orleans Saints start to drop games in a row moving here throughout the next little bit, that's where the panic button is absolutely acceptable. Coming up next, we're going to be taking a look at how the New Orleans Saints, or rather why the New Orleans Saints struggled against Philly's run defense and what Philly did that ended up being able to limit New Orleans on the ground and the ripple effect that that caused. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at DoorDash. DoorDash is my absolute favorite meal delivery app, food delivery app that I always rely on. And I don't just rely on them for meals coming from restaurants or anything like that. I will go to DoorDash to get something from the corner store. I'll go to DoorDash to get something from the grocery store. Any old thing. I'll go to DoorDash to imbibe a little bit, all that good stuff. There's great stuff over on DoorDash, and it's always there for you at your fingertips. So when you're having a busy day, when you're swamped, when you're not sure if you're going to be able to cook dinner, whether it's just for you or whether it's for the family, DoorDash, you can absolutely rely on. So go and check them out today. I know I'll be using them later on tonight. Use promo code locked fall 24. Use the numbers 2 and 4 to get 50% off up to a $10 value when you make a $15 or more purchase on your first order. Limited time offer, terms apply, and promo is not valid on orders that contain alcohol. DoorDash, your door to game day greatness, your door to more. Download DoorDash and the app now in order to order your game day favorites. You must be 21 or older to order alcohol. Drink responsibly, and of course, alcohol available only in select markets. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints drop a tough one here to the Philadelphia Eagles, 15-12. The offense for the New Orleans Saints racking up only 89 rushing yards in this game, and it really had everything to do with two big factors. The first of which was the Philadelphia Eagles' plan to stop the run, and the second of which was yards before contact. We haven't even gotten into the conversation around center Erik McCoy just yet. Erik McCoy left this game with an injury early on, 3 snaps in, and that looked like that had a big time impact on the New Orleans Saints, their run game, and therefore the ripple effect that ended up causing in terms of the run game being able to contribute to other things that the New Orleans Saints wanted to do on the offensive side. So let's start first with what it is that Philadelphia did, because Philadelphia grounded the ground game in a way that had a major impact for New Orleans. So Philly continued to play what was called a 6-1. And so what they would do is that they would have their usual 5 players down on the defensive line, sneak an extra guy down there so that they would get 6 on the line, and then have an overhang linebacker up over the top. That ended up crowding that line of scrimmage and then allowed the Philadelphia Eagles to beat the New Orleans Saints to the point of attack when it came to the run game. Now, the tricky part is that when it comes to the outside zone run, every area of the field is a point of attack. You saw Bill Belichick do a great job breaking that down a few days ago on one of his specials. And I think that why New Orleans ended up struggling with this is because it was coupled with stunts, twists, effective stems, things like that from the Philadelphia Eagles side. The reason why that ends up having an impact is that when you have all of those players in the defensive line that are moving as much as they're moving, stunting, twisting, one folding up over the top, one crashing lower than the other, all those other things, it makes it really hard to get your double teams lined up. So you end up in a lot of one-on-one situations. And the outside zone run game relies very heavily on some of these double teams, especially over to the intended play side, the ace blocks between the center and the guard, the duo blocks between the guard and the center, the guard and the tackle. You also get the tackle tight end blocks or the double tight end blocks if you have 2 tight ends over on one side, all of those things. And so Philly just came in with a really, really good run plan in order to stop the New Orleans Saints from being able to get going. And so what that ended up doing was it took away the effectiveness of the play action. It limited New Orleans in terms of their play calling ability because they continuously got into 3rd and long situations. Now, I will give credit to Derek Carr and Chris Olave for getting them out of a lot of those 3rd and long situations. Derek Carr was, I think it was 3 of 3, if not 4 of 4 to Chris Olave on 3rd downs, each of those completions leading to a converted first down. So huge for a fresh set of downs for New Orleans. And then you saw the 2 of them connect on the 13-yard touchdown, which was a thing of beauty, like a great play call, great play design that had Chris Olave wide open in the backcourt of the end zone. Fantastic throw, a great catch on the toe drag swag by Olave. You saw all of those things come together at different times, but just not as consistent as you're used to seeing them through the first 2 games of this season, where you saw New Orleans consistently winning with play action, consistently winning with motion, all these other things. So that's the ripple effect of what it is that Philadelphia did in limiting the New Orleans Saints run game, made things really tough for them. So they did that with that 6 down, 1 over the top type of a defense, and then 1 of their stunts and twists, eliminated some of those double teams, and then ended up being able to win at the point of attack with that game plan, a good game plan by Philly that New Orleans just simply wasn't able to adjust to in a way that was meaningful. And some of that might have been because they were without their anchor on the defense, on the offensive line in Erik McCoy for the majority of the game. You hate to pin an injury for a loss at any point, because that goes to show that, that kind of inherently says something about the replacement players and stuff like that. But I do think that New Orleans still has a big issue in terms of not having a focused backup center. They have a lot of guards that can play center, but they ain't got a lot of centers that can play guard that end up being able to come in place of Erik McCoy when it comes to a potential injury. And so this has been an issue for New Orleans since going all the way back to the Sean Payton days, and one that again reared its ugly head here in this situation up against Philly. The other thing that I thought that New Orleans struggled with when it came to the run game was getting a push, right? I spoke with one player in the locker room who said that they did a very good job at least falling forward after every play, but they didn't get the push that you need and that you want to get for Alvin Kamara so he can gain those yards before contact. And if you look at some of Kamara's bigger runs in this game, again, he still had 86, 87 rushing yards in this game. He had 87, and then Chris Olave had 86 receiving yards and a touchdown. But when you look at the fact that he still had those rushing yards, the plays that got him the majority of those rushing yards are ones where he had a clear area to be able to attack before any contact. But the Saints just weren't able to get that going very reliably throughout this game. And it felt like they might have kind of abandoned the run game before they necessarily needed to, but I guess it's tough because of the fact that you still ended up in a situation here to where you had, a short lead, but your run game wasn't working. But I guess that's not necessarily true either. I mean, New Orleans still ran 29 times versus 25 passes. So the balance was still in favor of the run, but the passing game was a little bit less efficient in this one. And I think some of that had to do with Derek Carr being under duress, Derek Carr being under pressure. There were a couple of play calls that would have been really, really good play calls had there been time for things to develop downfield, but they just simply didn't get the chance to develop downfield because the offensive line was in shambles by the time that it was all said and done. Not only did you lose Erik McCoy, but at one point you lost Cesar Ruiz for a play. And you have to imagine that whatever that injury was that had Cesar Ruiz on the ground for a little while, that maybe that might have impacted some of his play throughout. The Saints' interior offensive line got beat quite a bit. The defensive line for the Philadelphia Eagles getting its hand on footballs, things like that as well. So just a lot of things that ended up getting in the New Orleans Saints' way in the passing game as well. Rashid Shaheed targeted 5 times, no catches, no yards, no touchdowns in this game, of course, as a result. So just not the New Orleans Saints offense that you were expecting to see in this game. And a lot of it having to do with how well Philadelphia defended things, but then some of it has to do with the lack of execution over on the Saints offense's side. So I'm very interested to see, now that New Orleans kind of has this on tape in terms of what it is that they went up against, how do they adjust to it? Because now more teams are going to do what it is that Philly did if they have the personnel to get it done. So if the Saints were to see a similar approach to stopping the run next week against Atlanta, what do they do differently to take advantage of that? And some of the things that you're looking for could be things like jet sweeps and utilizing jet motion a little bit more to try to fool where the play side is and where the play is going and things like that. I think that we may have seen a little bit of a dip in motion in terms of the impact of motion, at least in this game. Can New Orleans get back to finding that impact in their run game? Because motion doesn't just help you in the passing game, it helps a ton in your ground game as well. And New Orleans just didn't seem to have the effectiveness or the efficiency that they needed in that area in this game. So that highlights where Philly played well, where New Orleans did not, what New Orleans can do to counteract it, and the fact that New Orleans must find a way to be able to kind of get past this and go into their next game. I had one player tell me that they were going to go over this, quote, with a callous grading system. So it's going to be very honest. It's going to be a very tell the truth kind of Monday when they go into their film session. And it's not going to go easy on these New Orleans Saints players. We'll see how things end up rolling as they continue through here, going into this Atlanta Falcons game in Atlanta next week, which of course we'll be in. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints defense ended up having a rough time by the time of the game came to a close because of its allowance of explosive plays. What went wrong? We'll break that down, and I'll give you some injury updates as I have them here. Continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook, the number one sportsbook out there. And the New Orleans Saints did not cover their 2.5-point favorite line when it came to this game. I'm looking to see if there's a line up for the Atlanta Falcons game yet. Not yet, because Atlanta still has to play against the Kansas City Chiefs later on. And so we'll probably wait for that to be done before they actually end up putting that up. But when it comes to what the New Orleans Saints weren't able to get done in this one, one of the things was that they weren't able to cover, and unfortunately we're not able to get a win. But you might like them up against the Atlanta Falcons next week, especially depending upon how they look in their game later on. So definitely some place to keep an eye out on, and especially right now, because you're going to be able to start your season with some big time returns over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So if you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can go and check it out. You'll see stats, you'll see play-by-play. There's some live betting options, things like that you can get in on as well. And right now, as a new customer, you're going to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet as a new customer over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints defense could not hold up for a full 60 minutes as the offense sputtered out of the gate and never really got its legs up underneath them. We appreciate you very much for being here and for making us your first listen of the day every day. We'll be back with another fresh episode tomorrow morning after I've gotten the opportunity to dive into a little bit of the tape. We'll kind of look at some of the other things that Philly did and where New Orleans came up short, how they can adjust and move forward. So one of the big things that we saw in this game that we haven't seen from New Orleans a bunch this season. We did see it once last week up against the Dallas Cowboys, but in this game, we saw several big explosive plays given up. Now you're going to hear a lot about the 65-yard rushing touchdown, which it just feels like the Philadelphia Eagles always find some way to break off some big run against the New Orleans Saints defense. That trend continued here with a 65-yard touchdown run against by Saquon Barkley. You saw a 61-yard catch and run by Dallas Goedert at a pivotal time in this game, a 3rd and 16 where the New Orleans Saints gave up the opposite of that, 61 yards on a big catch and run by the tight end. And then you also saw another big catch and run down the right sideline by Dallas Goedert on a missed tackle by Tyrann Mathieu. Just certain things that this New Orleans Saints team doesn't like to show, but absolutely did show throughout this game in very disappointing manner. And so the team unable on the defensive side to hold up for a full 60 minutes. Look, it gets tough when you lose time of possession 32 minutes and 15 seconds to 27 minutes and 45 seconds. It doesn't sound like a huge detriment, but it's more than 5 minutes where your defense is on the field. And those 5 minutes can become very, very, they can wear a lot when your offense can't stay on the field, right? So this was a big thing for the New Orleans Saints, that as the game wore on, their defenses typically get stronger, but in this matchup, it felt like the defense got a little bit weaker, and that ended up costing the New Orleans Saints some opportunities here. I also feel like the Saints' decision on 4th and 1 to run with Alvin Kamara up the middle, as opposed to leaning on their short yardage guy and Jamal Williams, or going for a field goal in that situation, being that they were in field goal territory, that field goal alone could have changed the game. If you really think about it, if they kick that field goal and they have 6 points to 7 points instead of 7 to 3 by the time that's all done, when the Saints go and they score their next touchdown, instead of them having a situation where they're going for 2 to create a 3-point deficit, they would have already had 3, plus they could have just kicked the extra point and been up 1 or had 16 points by the time that it was all said and done. If they would have taken that field goal at an earlier point, then that would have ended up changing sort of what the end of this game looked like. The Philadelphia Eagles going for it. I mean, getting the touchdown with Saquon Barkley, then getting the 2-point conversion, and then putting New Orleans in a situation where they were down 3 would have been a situation where New Orleans was still up 1, and they would have been going for onside kick and all those other things. So I think that that was another thing that ended up kind of plaguing New Orleans, was just a little bit of decision making there. And look, hindsight's 2020, right? So it's easy for me to say from looking at the end result, but even in that moment, I was confused as to why they didn't take the field goal, take the points when you're in that situation, especially when you know that your offense isn't clicking right now, right? So you got to take those points when you get the opportunities to get there. And I thought that you saw several of those bad decisions by Philly, who consistently refused to take points at an earlier time. Now we're talking about it differently because Philly still won the game. But man, if New Orleans would have eked this one out, even by getting in the field goal range, going to overtime, and then winning by a field goal in overtime or something like that, even if they would have done that, we'd be talking about how bad the decision making was by Philly to not take points at an earlier point. We got to look at it the same way for New Orleans. They should have taken the points at the earlier point in the game, and I think that would have ended up maybe benefiting them quite a bit there. I also believe that we saw the New Orleans Saints interior run defense get exposed a little bit in this game, or maybe just their run defense get exposed a little bit in this game as a whole. Look, Philly's a good run team, but it didn't come down to Jalen Hurts scrambling and making plays. The Saints struggled big time to defend and stop the run when it came to running back Saquon Barkley, who in this game had 147 rushing yards by himself and averaged, let me zoom in and make sure I'm seeing this number correctly. I am. Average 8.6 yards per carry on the ground, gave up 6.9 to the Philadelphia Eagles as a whole in this matchup. So I think one of the things that ended up costing New Orleans in this one is the fact that, like, they weren't playing with the big lead out there. They weren't eliminating the run game by virtue of what the offense is doing. And then I think what we learned is that the Saints run defense might not be as improved as maybe people would have thought that it was going into this game based on the first two games. Because we have to remember that in those first two games, the run defense held strong early, and then the opposing teams had to abandon the run. In this game, the Saints defense and run defense held strong early, but ended up giving up huge amounts of yardage by the time that the game was all said and done as well. So now my biggest concern for this team isn't actually the offense. It's not Klint Kubiak. It's not play calling. It's not Derek Carr. It's not the offense outside of the injury to Erik McCoy. Instead, my biggest concern for this team moving forward is going to be their run defense consistently. We did a Q&A before the game with the Locked On Saints insiders. And one of the questions that I was asked is, where do you think the New Orleans Saints fare most favorably? And where do you feel like the Eagles are outmatched, right? Or in favor of the Eagles. And I said that the place where I felt that the Saints fared the best was going to be in their matchup between their secondary and the wide receivers of the Philadelphia Eagles. That turned out to be correct. It was the tight ends that gave the New Orleans Saints a ton of trouble, a tale as old as time. And then you look at, on the opposite side of the football, the thing that I said was I'm concerned about the New Orleans Saints run defense up against Philadelphia's rushing offense. Why? Because it's a question mark, not because it's been proven to be bad, not because I'm expecting it to be bad or anything like that. It's just that we hadn't really seen the run defense have to play 4 quarters. We haven't really had to see the run defense manage adversity. This was the first time that we really saw that from New Orleans. So the Saints have got to get their run defense figured out. And at least, if nothing else, as proven by the Philadelphia Eagles, you don't have to make personnel changes to get that done. You just have to get better, and you just have to execute better on that side of the game plan and have a better game plan going into games. Now, the Saints have a big test up against the Philadelphia Eagles, up against the Atlanta Falcons next week when it comes to the run game. Bijan Robinson, that is a team that has consistently run well against the New Orleans Saints over the course of the past couple of years. I think with the exception of last year's Week 18 matchup, but I might be wrong on that. But we saw a pair of matchups before that where New Orleans surrendered over 200 team rushing yards to Atlanta. So that's going to be a big measure for New Orleans in terms of their ability to be successful against the Falcons this upcoming weekend. So a big matchup there to watch within the big matchup to watch. I think that's got to be a big thing. And look, maybe the Saints get a little bit of a boost in the run game when it comes to Colin Saunders getting back out there, which is a possibility for Week 3, because he seemed like he was inching towards playing or coming back pretty soon. So we'll see where things go. As for injury updates, look, Taysom Hill was not in this game. Dennis Allen said that he was actually not too far away from playing, but the Saints made the decision not to put him out there. Jay Glazer giving a little bit of an update on NFL Sunday, whatever the pregame show is. And one of the things they talked about was that New Orleans, or that Taysom Hill had experienced a lung bruise, right? A bruised lung. And so that was the thing that ended up holding him out in this game. New Orleans, quote unquote, was saving him from himself a little bit, is what Jay Glazer said. And so they didn't put him out there. We'll see if he's able to get back against Atlanta. Dennis Allen saying that they definitely want him back up against Atlanta. So we'll see where things go there. Erik McCoy is going to be the big injury to watch. It's a groin injury for him, something that plagued the New Orleans Saints big time all throughout training camp. So would not be surprised to see Erik McCoy miss some time here, but we'll see where things go. Let me not speculate on that. Let's wait and see where things go, but I just simply would not be surprised. New Orleans, again, not having that backup center, that natural backup center yet again on their roster. will be very interesting to see where they go going into week 4. What we're probably going to see is Lucas Patrick move to center and then Ali Udoh come in at left guard. Maybe with a week of practice that ends up getting better in terms of what that looks like. But right now I wouldn't have super high hopes for what that setup looks like for New Orleans, at least based upon the struggles that we saw today. You could see Nick Saldiveri jump in at left guard if he feels like he's ready to go. And if the Saints feel like he's ready to go, he just missed so much time during training camp. I don't blame New Orleans for going to Ali Udoh, the experienced veteran, in this situation where you have to make a swap in game. But with a week of practice to prepare, maybe we see Nick Saldiveri step in there, unless Erik McCoy is back for next week. So we'll see where things go. Cesar Ruiz also left for a play and then came back. Just one to watch to see if that ends up lingering for a long time. And then Demario Davis left the game late in this game with a hamstring / groin tightness issue. So another big one to watch, because no Demario Davis would be big up against that run offense of the Atlanta Falcons, especially after seeing how the Saints run defense got handled in this game with him as a part of it. So we'll see where things go for New Orleans health-wise as they move forward. Coming up in tomorrow morning's episode, we're going to dive deeper into this one. We'll get into a little bit more of the schematics, a little bit deeper than we did going into some of the schematics. We'll kind of get into our morning after reaction, some game balls, things like that as well. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen. For your second listen, please go and check out Locked On NFL. They'll be talking about Upset Sunday today. So Tyler Rowland and Tony Wiggins giving you your double dose of NFL news all day over at Locked On NFL, which you can get wherever you get your podcast. We appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.